everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Do you ever think about how so many people can be gathered in the same place at the same time, but how vastly different their individual experiences can be? On a large scale, this is the world. On a smaller scale, take Disneyland, for example, the happiest place on Earth. For some, maybe. But what about the employees, the ones who have to walk the dark tunnels beneath the park, cleaning up after other people's children? The same children pulling on their costumes, all while they try to stay jolly and avoid having a heat stroke. Someone just had the best day of their life next to someone who's having their worst one yet. Our experiences are our own and exist separately, but simultaneously with others and theirs. There's a word for it all, one that comes from the dictionary of obscure sorrows, one that maybe you've heard before: Sonder. The realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own, populated with their own ambitions, friends, routines, worries, and inherited craziness. An epic story that continues invisibly around you like an anthill sprawling deep underground, with elaborate passageways to thousands of other lives that you'll never know existed, in which you might appear only once as an extra, sipping coffee in the background, as a blur of traffic passing on the highway, as a lighted window at dusk. Basically, everyone has a story. If they were all the same, life would be far less interesting, less vivid. How lucky am I to get to share some of the most vivid ones imaginable with you? The luckiest. So, let's get started, shall we? This New Year's Day, I wanted to do something special with my boyfriend. So we spent the night at a fancy desert resort. The whole day was absolutely wonderful. We relaxed by the pool, saw some native wildlife, had great food, and so much more. By nightfall, we were quite tired from being in the sun all day. We decided to have a relaxing night in, just watching movies and pigging out. At 11, we heard a party starting in the sand dunes, but we didn't think anything of it. Of course, people were partying on New Year's. The music was loud. People were yelling and laughing. They seemed to be having a great time. When our movie marathon ended, it was around 3 o'clock, and we were exhausted. But the party was still going strong. Good for them. Except it continued on that way until 5:30. It was annoying, but nothing weird. Until it was time for us to check out, and I commented about the crazy party that lasted all night. She said the party in the main hall was great, but they ensured it only stayed open until around 2. That was pretty weird. Thinking out loud, I wondered if people had camped close to the resort and thrown a party. But the receptionist said that wouldn't be possible. The resort owns roughly 500 acres, so it would be impossible for anyone to camp close by. We definitely heard a loud-ass party next to us. Freaked out and determined to find a rational explanation, we checked out the suspected area. But there were no signs of a party. Nothing was there except a vast, empty desert. Now we were freaked out and just wanting to get the hell away from there, but I couldn't let it go. Later, I started Googling keywords, and I read that jinns live in the desert, and they're known to congregate near people having parties and drinking. So, was this a group of jinns out having a good time? Or am I looking too deep into this? There's a men's Christian homeless shelter in my city. I was homeless in 2010, around the time they purchased and converted an old VFW bar. They were digging out the basement to make room for showers and dorms, but I think they woke something in the process. Or something was attracted to the homeless. I was in and out of the shelter a few times over the following years. Sometimes I'd wake up from an episode to see a shadow gliding across the floor and up a wall. When I stayed there last year, I felt that thing's energy, and I've never felt anything like it. This thing knew I could sense it too, and it hated that. One night, I was laying on my mat, and off to the left, I saw a head peeking around the doorway when it suddenly flew at me before disappearing. I didn't know what to think. It all happened within a few seconds. I eventually fell asleep, and I had a sleep paralysis episode, but I managed to break free of it. I sat up to see an entity standing at the other end of the room. It wasn't a shadow. It was a very tall, gaunt, feminine entity. It had a weird-shaped head with horns and a crown of obscenities stitched together by razor wire. Its eyes were hollow and black, while its mouth was small with sharp teeth. More razor wire was wrapped around its body, and several strands were wrapped around the homeless men. It looked at me, screamed, and vanished. I've never seen anything like it, and it's still there, growing stronger by feeding on the weak. Is it a succubus or something else? This thing definitely had feminine features. I wish I could draw it. If you've read my previous stories, you know that I used to do trauma scene cleanup. If you don't know what that is, I basically managed a crew that went into buildings where someone was killed, committed suicide, or died by accident. Really, any situation where someone suffered a messy end. Over the course of my career, we had a few gang-related murders. The majority were Mexican gangs, but there were a few Asian gangs too. Most deaths were the result of home invasions, but some were specifically meant to harm the families of those involved. They were sending a message. Surprisingly, not all of them were that messy, but the walls were usually riddled with bullet holes. We would remove the drywall to sanitize everything, so the family only saw clean-cut drywall, not 60 bullet holes. Blood was most often localized to where the deceased fell. In those cases, we would just cut out the carpet, or if it had a hard surface, we just cleaned and disinfected the area. If there were soft materials like bed or sofa, we'd dispose of those as well. As promised, the following is the worst gang hit scene I ever saw. It wasn't the number of people killed, it's what happened after the fact. In the early 90s, we responded to a call for homicide cleanup. It was a nice 2-story home in a Los Angeles suburb. We got called to bad areas just as often as nice ones. Terrible things can happen no matter where you live, but they may happen more often if you involve yourself with the wrong activities. We don't know the full extent of who the murder victim was, but we knew it was related to the Mexican cartel. The scene wasn't reported because someone heard gunshots. No, a neighbor saw water flowing from the house and down the driveway. They must have called the fire department after not being able to find the resident. Apparently, the guy was taking a shower upstairs when the gunmen entered the house and found him. The intruder sprayed the shower with bullets. He must have had a silencer for none of the neighbors to hear it. As the deceased fell, his body covered the drain, causing the shower to fill up with bloody water. It then overflowed to the downstairs rooms and out the garage door, before ultimately making its way down the driveway. For this to happen, he must have been shot at least 2 days prior. Not only was everything wet inside, it had soaked in bloody water. Since there was so much water, most of it was diluted, but there were areas where the blood clearly stained material, mostly upstairs near the bathroom. The smell, as everything started to dry, was nasty. Sometimes when I'm at a meat counter and they're spraying down the butcher area, it reminds me of being in that house. Looking inside the shower, I saw the bullet holes were at mid-height level and more ran down onto the floor. The hitman must have kept shooting him after he fell, probably wanted to make sure he was dead. While we were working inside, the police took some stuff, but most of the personal items were still there. We saw that he had a family. There were pictures of them and kids' clothing, so he didn't live alone, but he was the only one killed. We were never told what happened to the rest of the family, but I assume the killer waited for him to be alone. This has been happening for roughly 2 years, and my family and I have heard it all. It started with a knock at the door while Mom was cleaning the kitchen. It was 10 p.m., and since my father was working out of town, she wasn't going to open the door for anyone she didn't know. She looked outside, but no one was there. She thought she was hearing things until my sister came out of her room, saying that she also heard a knock. A couple of months later, my parents went to have drinks with friends, and they let my sister and I stay home. We were chilling in the living room, and I forgot to lock the door after taking the dogs out. Suddenly, there was a loud knock. My sister looked outside, but she saw nothing and quickly locked the door. A week later, I was in the living room petting our dogs on the sofa when I heard a quiet knock. It was almost midnight, so I told my father. Nothing was there when he checked, but I'm positive I heard a knock. After that day, we didn't hear the knock again until today, January 16th. It was 10:30 p.m., and I came to sit in the living room because I had a bad feeling about being in the back rooms. I talked to my mom for maybe 10 minutes before we heard a little knock. We thought nothing of the first one, but after the second time, Mom asked if someone was knocking. Then, a third and final knock sounded, and my sister confirmed that's what it is. We don't live in a bad neighborhood. What could all this knocking be? I need help figuring out what I saw today. It's June 1st, 2022, and around 9:30 p.m., I went to my grandma's house in hopes of getting a jacket. She lives behind someone's house, and we know them pretty well, so I cut through their driveway. Using the alleyway is kind of weird since I'm still a kid. Grandma has a tree in front of her house, and the owner put a 2 to 3 foot tall wooden board against it. I heard a sound while walking and quickly turned on my phone's light, pointing it at the sound. Behind the board was a deer's head with white eyes and a human body. I live in a city, so deers aren't exactly common. I was frozen only for a moment before running to Grandma's house, terrified and pounding on her door. She wanted to know why I looked so frightened, and I told her it was because I saw something. Knowing I don't scare easily, she offered to walk me home, but as we went to leave, my dad ran in. He wanted to know where we were going, but he didn't know what to say when I relayed what happened. I've seen a lot, but nothing has ever scared me like this. I could really use your help. So, the solar eclipse from 2017 sort of turned into a mini holiday for the US and my state. It happened about midday, and at work we were encouraged to step outside when it started. I saw it with everyone, and then I went back inside. I was about to resume my work, but for some reason, I went back outside instead. There were still a few people standing around, and when I looked up again, I sensed a powerful entity traveling with the eclipse. It wasn't visual, it was just a strong impression. I sensed it was the spirit of revenge, traveling with the eclipse and taking notes of the abuses people have inflicted. It was looking down at the population in large swaths, and it sensed me looking at it too. It didn't seem like it had much time to stop and think about someone like me. It was a short experience, but it left a strong impression. The day-to-day lives of humans are barely a blip on an angel's radar. I'm also irritated that I'm not spiritual. I feel like a spiritual person should have been the one to see it. I mentioned it to 2 people on Facebook and my mom. Plus, I mentioned it on Twitter months ago, but on some level, I was waiting for someone important to say something. This happened when I was 5, and I'm in my 30s now. It's been a long time, but I can remember it like yesterday. That's how much it terrified me. I woke to being pulled from bed, and a weird greenish white light illuminating my room, while a robotic yet angelic voice filled my head, saying they came to take me away. I was confused, and I tried to look back, but they kept pushing me forward. Then, like it never happened, I was suddenly back in bed, facing the wall. I stayed that way, too terrified to roll over. I know it happened, but it was gone with the snap of a finger, like waking from a dream. I'm not sure if it's connected, but after playing outside, I noticed a weird tiny shard in my toe. It looked like a shard from a broken beer bottle, but I had no cuts. I removed it years later. It was soft and bendy. I've seen tons of UFOs where I grew up. I saw one zigzag across the sky very fast before disappearing. On another occasion, I watched a big, round object that resembled a Christmas tree bulb rotate in the sky. It turned in different directions and shot off in the blink of an eye. I've also experienced some weird time lapses. One night during summer vacation, I was watching TV when I turned to look out the window and back again. It happened in a split second. Only a different program was on the TV, and suddenly it was daylight. A year later, I had another weird experience like the first one. I was paralyzed, and that weird green light was back, along with the robotic yet angelic voice in my head. This time it said, "Do not be afraid. My name is Andy, and I have come to check on you. We always come. Then I woke up. I'm not sure if Andy is what it said, but that's what it sounded like. I don't expect anyone to believe this, but I wanted to share it anyway. I get sleep paralysis on rare occasions, and I think they happen when I encounter a spirit. Sometimes I can astral project during sleep paralysis. I've done it a few times now. The first instance was during an episode I had on the couch. I sat up and looked around before realizing I couldn't physically feel anything. I looked down at my sleeping form, and that was cool as fuck. But then it got weird. There was an electronic sound, followed by a screeching shadow figure bursting into the room. It didn't attack my physical body, but my spiritual one. And it knocked my phone onto the floor when it moved the coffee table. I didn't know what to do, but I laid back into my body and I woke up. I know it was real because the coffee table was moved and my phone was on the ground. The second time, I was knocked out of my body by a strange shadow thing. It started as a sleep paralysis episode. When I'm having one, my face goes numb like I've been sedated. That feeling had subsided, and I was scanning the room when I saw something in my peripheral vision. It was a humanoid shadow figure with a stick-thin body and an oval-shaped head. I couldn't see any distinguishing features. It was both moving and stationary at the same time. But I can't really explain how. It's like it was transitioning between reality and a dream. I kept staring at it, hoping the sleep paralysis would end, but it only ended after the figure came much closer. I didn't see it move, yet somehow it knocked me out of my body, and I fell onto the ground, paralyzed and staring up at the dark figure. It was hovering over my body, attaching some kind of webs to me. I felt like it was trying to possess my physical form. It took great effort to figure out how to move, but I managed to fly back into my body and wake up. I don't know if it was a lucid dream, but I saw it as clear as day. And it didn't feel like a dream. I live in Alaska, and we have a legend of creatures called the Kushtaka. They're half otter, half man things that can mimic voices and lure people to their doom, similar to Will-o'-the-Wisp. One day, my friend Sam was hunting with his father and brother. They'd been out for a while when he heard his father's voice calling him from behind. But he could see his father about 20 feet ahead. Sam hurried to catch up, asking if his father said anything, but he hadn't. He did, however, hear the same thing his son had. He told Sam to grab his brother and come right back, and that's what he did. Once they returned, their father said, "Listen very carefully. When I say go, I want you two to follow me as closely as you can. Ready? Go." They all began sprinting through the woods at a breakneck speed. Sam swore he could hear something chasing after them, but he never looked back. After a few minutes, his father pulled them into an alcove behind a fallen log. They waited there in complete silence as they saw something furry and wet run by their hiding spot, and it smelled like rotten fish. Once enough time passed without hearing anything, they left the hiding spot, and they saw something. They saw some odd-looking footprints, more animal than human, and Sam found a bit of hair stuck in the nearby branch. He showed me the fur, and it was extremely gross. It was green and slimy, and it only looked like hair until I touched it. Then it was obviously fur. Plus, Sam had never lied to me before. I have no doubt that he saw Akustika. Aside from the lights shutting off on their own, or the faint sense of being watched, there was one undeniable moment when I realized my basement is truly haunted. I was only supposed to be down there for a minute. I was storing away some boxes, didn't bother turning on the light. After setting everything down, I started back towards the stairs. But for some reason, I stopped to wonder how long I could calmly sit in the dark. I stood very still and took deep, calming breaths while saying a random mantra of mine. Fear is just a mechanism, an evolutionary trait that helped us survive when sleeping in dark caves. After a few repeats, I heard a fucking growl. It sounded like a zombie. It was loud. I instantly noped out, sprinted up the stairs. I was on the ground floor in under a second. I know nothing chaotic happened, but hearing such a real and angry growl after 10 minutes of utter silence, it confirmed that something supernatural was living in my basement. This really happened 5 years ago, and I can still hear the growl in my head. And if you're wondering, it wasn't the boiler. It was a finished basement. I even had an Xbox down there. I would literally game for hundreds, maybe thousands of hours. Not once, never, did I hear the boiler make anything remotely close to that sound. Recently, my husband's grandfather passed away. Soon after he, our 2 kids, and I moved in with his grandmother. We're actually sleeping in her bedroom, where her husband passed away. I think it's too soon to say anything about what I've seen. I've never experienced anything like this before, which is why I'm coming here for feedback. My first sighting of his grandfather happened when I was entering the living room, and I saw a shadow pass by the wall where his chair sits. The second time, I was leaving the laundry room, and I swear I saw him bent down. The third time, it happened when I was walking down the hall to my children's room before going to bed. Our room is on the right, and when passed by, I saw my husband's grandfather laying on the bed. He was covered up, and I could only see his face, but it was him. It still seems so surreal. I'm getting goosebumps as I write this. I do believe in God, and I'm a Christian, but I've never experienced anything like this. My husband, Hank, and I were still engaged when living in the home we called the Hammond House. It was named after the neighborhood. We lived there for 5 years and moved out shortly after our wedding. It was built in the 1970s, and too many strange things happened to relay them all, but I'll try. Before we even moved in, an elderly woman died inside. It was heavily remodeled after a fire, and someone had crashed their car through the living room. The activity we experienced started off small and escalated. The first night, we unpacked everything and got the house ready to be lived in. I was having trouble falling asleep when I felt an overwhelming urge to look down, and I saw a fat cockroach crawl beneath our bed. We hadn't even eaten in there yet. I know it's not supernatural, but it definitely felt like a bad omen. Hank has a shelf full of memorabilia that he arranges in a very particular order, and on countless mornings, we've woken up to find everything shifted out of place, just by a few inches. Sometimes the items would be turned diagonally, but remain in their proper positions. In his signed football souvenirs, they'd be face down and turned in the completely opposite direction. We discussed possible explanations, tested theories like maybe our speakers are vibrating hard enough to move things, but none of the explanations panned out. This is when we jokingly began referring to these events as goblin activity. Several people lived with us during our time spent in the Hammond house, including my friends Charlotte and Laura, along with Hank's teenage niece and nephew, Abby and Andy. Everyone who stayed there reported hearing someone else's voice, even when that person wasn't home. Andy heard Laura and I laughing in my room while I was at work. Laura heard me loudly whispering to Hank while he slept, but again, I was at work. Charlotte heard Hank pacing our bedroom while having a heated argument, but he was actually at work. Abby heard me and Charlotte cooking in the kitchen when neither of us were home. And Hank, he heard our cat meowing while she was sleeping in his lap. Abby also had terrible night terrors while living with us, but she never had them before or since. She'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming and convinced someone was banging on her bedroom door. We let our husky, Cal, sleep with her on those nights. From the living room couch, I could see through the dining room window and into the bedroom window. I would get chills, look to my bedroom window, and see the curtains deliberately pulled back just a few inches, as if someone were sneaking a peek. There were no vents under the window, no airflow. There was no viable explanation for this. After the first time, I started keeping the door shut and leaving the overhead fan off, just to make sure I wasn't mistaken, but the curtain only moved when I was home alone. Ultimately, we bought a curtain for the dining room window to ease my wariness, but it didn't help my overall state of mind very much. This next one, it isn't supernatural, but it is pertinent to the story. Over the course of 1 year, all 3 of our dogs died in that house. 2 two-year-old husky siblings passed from a genetic kidney disorder that they shared, and Cal succumbed to cancer at age 12. I know it's irrational, but I blame that house for stealing my babies. The puppies died before Cal, and he became very attached to me afterwards, but he also developed an almost aggressive distrust for our hallway closet. He would constantly lay there, sniffing under the door or pacing like something was in there. We checked multiple times, but there was nothing. One day, he was guarding the closet when I was home alone and in the shower, which is next door to this closet. When I bent over to grab the soap, I heard an unknown male voice coming from the closet. I quickly got out of the shower, still dripping wet. I inched my way to the door, listening. "Hello?" I finally whispered, but there was no response. I pressed my ear against the door, like the cliche that I am, and I heard a scratching sound. I screeched and ran to my bedroom with Cal, where we remained, barricaded and crying, until Hank came home. On another night, I was half asleep and waiting for Hank to come home when I woke to a sinking sensation of someone slipping onto his side of the bed. I flung my arm out to feel for him, but no one was there. I couldn't sleep until he got home. The last thing that happened before we moved is the event that shook me the most. I used to lay in my recliner, and my long hair would dangle over the back. My cat always saw this as a toy and tried to climb my hair like a curtain. So, when I felt my hair being tugged, I didn't think anything of it until I realized the cat was sleeping in my lap. The moment I realized that was happening, the grip on my hair was released. Once again, I screamed, cried, and hid in my room until Hank came home. There's so many smaller things that aren't even worth mentioning. Little items went missing and reappearing in strange places. It was always something we needed, like a tool or a key. We moved shortly after the hair-pulling incident, and we haven't had any goblin activity since. I'm not looking for advice. I just needed a place to get this off my chest. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode, but don't miss a brand new one every Friday night, and my other weekly uploads every Sunday and Wednesday. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to The Darkest Hour if you haven't already, tap the bell, and of course, talk to me in the comments. A huge shout out to all of my patrons whom I appreciate so very much: Tracy S., Monica L., ZOEWATT, Shelly B., Donald C., Rat Girl, Alicia S., ERIN G., NIKKI H., Mr. Revenant, Naz K., Brendan G., and Paul T. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour, or click the link in the description to learn more. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.